see. Can I make this? All right. So I think last week we talked about the image of the beast from Revelation 13. And Revelation 13 is probably when you think of the book of Revelation, you probably think of this chapter, verses 11 to 18. That's where we get the talk of the mark of the beast. That's where we get 666, things like that. And so I'm doing like 3 parts to this study, or I should say 3 studies to this particular section to chapter 13. And the first one that we're doing right now is the image of the beast. And a lot of people might be wondering why the image of the beast? Why aren't we doing one on the mark of the beast? Because that's what everyone wants to know about, right? Everybody wants to know, what is the mark of the beast? Is it here? And I'm here to tell you that the thing that we probably need to be concerned about isn't so much. I mean, I shouldn't say we shouldn't be worried about it, but the thing that should be, at the top of our list of things that we need to be looking for or watching out for is the image of the beast, before the mark of the beast, because the mark, which we'll talk about, in a week or two, that's more spiritual in nature, more so than it is a physical thing. In fact, I'm not even positive there's a physical component to the mark of the beast. I think it's primarily or possibly even entirely spiritual. Whereas the image of the beast, I believe, is something physical. And so that's something that we need to look out for, something we need to watch out for. And it is more, and I said this last week, it's more scandalous than the mark of the beast. But yet the mark of the beast gets the most attention. And then lastly, we'll look at the number of the beast, which we all are probably, even people that aren't Christians, people that might not read their Bible, they're familiar with the number of the beast. They know 666. And we'll take a look at that as well. There's some interesting things about that you might not know. We went through an overview of the second beast, what he does, and then we're paying particular attention. And this is why I have it first, is because the image of the beast is referenced 4 times in this passage, in this section. And it's the first thing mentioned. So it's the first thing that we're going to look at. I asked last week, what is the image in reference to the image of the beast? Is it a statue? I know some people have thrown that idea out there that it's a statue. Maybe it's a coin. The beast puts his image on a coin, and that's what we have to use to buy or sell, and in a way we worship it. Maybe his likeness is imprinted on a coin. Within the past couple decades, people have thrown out the idea of, maybe the image of the beast is some sort of hologram, and we worship that, something technological, or maybe it's a clone, maybe it's something genetically modified, and we're supposed to worship that. But in order to understand the book of Revelation, in order to understand this imaging language, we have to understand, the foundation to which the book of Revelation is built upon. And it really has its basis in the Old Testament. There's a scholar, he wrote a book here called John's Use of the Old Testament and Revelation. His particular expertise is in the book of Revelation. And he says that, it's widely acknowledged that the Apocalypse, which is the book of Revelation, it contains more references to the Old Testament than any other New Testament book. And obviously that depends on how you're quantifying things. But, however you want to look at it, it is one of the most Old Testament referenced books that we have in the New Testament. And so it would be wise of us to, to do our study on the Old Testament, or pay close attention to what's being talked about in the Old Testament. And, that's my whole thing, is I want people to understand how the Old and New Testament flow together. Because for a long time, I had difficulty figuring out, like, how do these two books mesh together? And they do so very cohesively once you understand a few keys. And that's kind of what my whole thing's been about. All these studies that I do, they really have they really built upon ideas that we find in the Old Testament. And a lot of times as Christians, we tend to kind of skip over the Old Testament and go right to the New Testament, because the New Testament, it's a lot easier to read than the Old Testament. The New Testament is filled with letters, and they're like, the style of writing is discourse. In other words, we're reading something and it's telling us, how we should live our lives, things that we should do. And that's generally easy to comprehend. The Old Testament is filled with more variation when it comes to particular writing styles. And so we have to keep that in mind when we read the Old Testament, that all these different writing styles are there for a reason, and they're to help us, and it's to help us understand the story that God's trying to tell. And so I asked a question last week. We get this image of the beast, and I asked, where else in the Bible, or more specifically, where else in the Old Testament do we see the word image, or do we get this imaging language? And believe it or not, it's on the first page of the Bible, in the first chapter. When God creates humanity, it says, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And then it says that that's what he did. He created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. And so that begs another question. Is that imaging language that we read about in Revelation 13, is that connected to this image that we see in Genesis chapter 1? And then we go through a little study. We did a little study last week of, how you can track ideas from the New Testament, see if they have any precedence in the Old Testament. And so we went and we looked at that word image in Revelation 13. And since the New Testament was written in Greek, we get the Greek word for what image was, what John used. And it was icon. And it means image or likeness. And then the question we should then be asking is, well, is that the same word used in Genesis chapter 1? And here's where we encounter, our first interpretive challenge, is the Old and New Testaments were written in different languages. The New Testament was written in Greek, while the Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew with a little bit of Aramaic. And so since we have a language difference here, how do we know that, the same idea, John has that same idea, he's borrowing it from Genesis chapter 1? How do we know that? Well, that's where something called the Septuagint comes in handy. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it was compiled or written in the 3rd century before Jesus. And it contains these other, I wouldn't say scripture, but it contains other Jewish literary works that were held in high esteem, but they weren't considered scripture. We get things like the Book of Enoch, the Maccabees, the Book of Wisdom, things like that. The very first edition of the King James Bible contained these books as well, which I don't think a lot of people know. Um, the New Testament writers obviously then were familiar with this because they were writing in Greek. Chances are they used the Septuagint as a reference when they were going back to the Old Testament because it was written in Greek. And so if we use the Septuagint then, and we go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and we look up the Greek word used in the Septuagint, well, what do you know? It's that same word. It's icon or icon, the very same word. So there we have a connection. The exact same word used in Genesis 1:26 when it said God was going to make man in his icon. That same word is used in reference to the image of the beast, which is interesting. What does that mean? So if icon in Genesis 1:26 is referencing humans made in God's likeness, then is it possible that John's use of that word in Revelation 13 is a humanity made in the beast likeness? And if so, how is that possible, and what does that mean? And then I tried to direct our attention to this idea of the collective, image. In Genesis 1:26 refers to a collective group of people or a collective group of beings, which is humanity. So does the image of the beast in Revelation 13, does that also refer to a collective group of beings, humans, possibly? And then that's where we come to a fork in the road, which is often the case when reading the Bible, trying to interpret it. We have to ask ourselves, is John trying to direct our attention to Genesis chapter 1 when he's referencing the image of the beast? If the answer is yes, then that's going to lead us down one path. If the answer is no, that's going to lead us down a different path. And we come to this part where we come to this fork in the road where it's like it could go either way. We got to find the evidence for going down either road. And at some point, the evidence on one side or the other is going to tip the scale for us. It's going to tell us which road, is the one we should go down. And that's what this study is about, is going down that road of, is this referring to a type of being or a type of humanity in a collective sense? And not in the sense that the image of the beast is like a statue or a painting that we have to worship. Is it referring to a collective group of beings or humanity, if you will? And that's what I want to explore in the rest of this study. What might that look like? And so that's where we left off last Wednesday. And so as we continue today, I've kind of broken down the rest of this study into 3 parts, maybe 4, but I think 3 will get the point across. If that is the case, if the image of the beast is referring to some type of collective group of beings, possibly like a modified humanity, maybe, then we really got to go back and understand, what does it mean? Because humans are created in the image of God. Only humans are, not the animals and not plants. In terms of earthly beings, only humans were created in the image of God. And so we really have to understand, what does it mean to be human? And that's a big, philosophical question. It seems like it would be easy to answer, but it's more challenging than you would think. So I think that's the basis on which we need to try and figure this out is we got to understand, what does it mean to image God? And that is connected to, well, then what does it mean to be human, since humans image God? And so we'll look at that today. And then in the coming weeks, we'll look at some stuff like transhumanism.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's something that should require our attention, that we should be aware of as Christians, especially in today's day and age, this idea of transhumanism. And then after that, I want to look at this idea of re-enchantment. And that has to deal with like worldview stuff, like how we view the world, where society is going as a collective. And it's really interesting because you think that these ideas of transhumanism, because they're rooted in like science and technology, that they would be purely secular in their worldview. And that's definitely not the case. Transhumanism, I believe, is more tied to spirituality than it is secularism. And so if that's the case, then this idea of re-enchantment or enchantment in general plays a big part in this transhumanism, ideology. But first, before we get to that, we have to understand, what does it mean to be human? That's a question people have asked, pretty much from the beginning of time. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be made in God's image? Dr. Michael Heiser, he has an article on one of his websites talking about this very thing. He has 2 articles. They're quite lengthy, and because he's a scholar, pretty technical. I'll link to them at the end of this study, and you can read the entire thing, for yourself. But this is what he says at the beginning of his article. He says, understanding what it means to be human, our very humanity, is both an ancient and modern question. Not surprisingly, the Bible has something to say about the subject, a lot actually. And then he says this, unfortunately, the stage is set for the question to become one of this century's greatest challenges to the church. This isn't because there is no biblical answer. Rather, it is because few Christians know it is a subject for serious thought. So that's something we, keep that in mind, that he says that the stage is set for this question to become one of the century's greatest challenges to the church. And we got to have an answer for it. And we do. It's not that the Bible lacks an answer for what it means to be human. It's just that, this question's going to come up, and we got to know our stuff. Go ahead, Lito.
Can you please send that link to us, the link to the article?
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So what does it mean to bear God's image? What does it mean to be an image bearer of God? The answers that have been put forth, generally speaking, are lacking. And he says, this is from his book, The Unseen Realm. He says, among the list of proposed answers to what image bearing means are a number of abilities or properties. And then he lists them, like intelligence. Some people say, well, it's our intelligence that makes us image bearers of God, more so than plants or animals. Some people say it's our ability to reason. Others say it's our emotions, our ability to commune with God, self-awareness, language/communication ability, or free will. And then Dr. Heiser says the problem with defining the image by any of these qualities is that on one hand, non-human beings like animals possess some of these abilities. And we know that animals aren't made in the image of God. You know, animals can display emotion, you know. They have are animals self-aware? I don't know. maybe not.
Some animals are definitely much smarter.
Yeah, some animals are definitely much smarter than other animals, that's for sure. So, you know, listing these abilities doesn't necessarily mean that that's not what makes us in the image of God. Then he uses another example, you know, the pro-life position. He says it's based on the proposition that human life, and so personhood, begins at conception. The simple-celled zygote inside the woman's womb, which pro-lifers to be believe to be a human person, is not self-aware. It has no intelligence, no rational thought processes or emotions. It can't speak or communicate, and it can't commune with God or pray, and it cannot exercise its will or respond to the conscience. You know, and we as Christians believe that life begins at conception, you know, but when conception happens, you know, that life doesn't yet have intelligence, you know, it can't speak or communicate. So it's not abilities that make us imagers of God. Or if you even think of people that might be mentally handicapped, that, you know, these things might not apply to them. That doesn't mean that they're not made in the image of God. So we know that it's not about abilities that make us image bearers of God. It has to be something else. It has to be something else. And then he goes on with this. If you want to argue that those things are there potentially, then that means you only have a potential person, which we as Christians don't believe that. That's actually a pro-choice position. Potential personhood is not actual personhood. So the idea of bearing God's image, you know, it's really the abortion debate is really rooted in, you know, the being in the image of God. When abortions happen, they're killing imagers of God. And it doesn't have anything to do with their abilities or anything like that. And so he argues that defining image bearing as any ability is a flawed approach. So then some people ask, well, what about the soul? Maybe it's because we have a soul that sets us apart, you know, from other life, you know, plants and animals. And then he goes to show that in Genesis chapter 1, in verses 20 and 30, the Hebrew word for soul is nephesh. And according to the Bible in these verses, animals also possess this nephesh, or a soul. And we know animals aren't
image bearers.
They're not image bearers. Let me read you Genesis 1:30. It says, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, that is nephesh, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. So he says the birds and the animals, they have this nefesh, they have this breath of life, they have this soul. So we know that the soul that's not really what makes us image bearers. And so what is it? How do we understand divine image bearing in a way that does not stumble over these issues? And the key to understanding it is found in the Hebrew grammar. In English, we use the preposition in to denote many different ideas. So think of, we're made in the image of God. So, and he uses a couple examples in the book, like I put the dishes in the sink. The in there denotes location. Or if I say I broke the mirror in pieces, the in there denotes the result of a particular action. If I say I work in education, the in there denotes that I work as a teacher or an administrator in some educational capacity. And it's that third one, as that's what the Hebrew grammar indicates. So humanity was created as God's image. That might be a better translation, that we were created as God's image. And so the idea of being made in God's image, it isn't about an ability. It's not necessarily something that we can possess in like it's not something that we can earn, or it's not something that can be worked towards, but rather it's just a status that we have. God made us as his representatives on this earth. So we're supposed to mirror God on this earth. So to be human is to image God, because we are his representatives. So I take you back to the initial question, or I'll ask a question based off of one of the previous slides that we looked at, and I asked a question: why does Dr. Heiser think that how we answer this question is going to be one of the church's greatest challenges moving forward? Why is this such an important topic? And he doesn't really necessarily answer it in the article, I don't think. And so my guess is as to why he says this is going to be a big challenge for us is the idea of transhumanism. A lot of people think that transhumanism is like science fiction, and it's not really. You read the leading medical and science journals, they're talking about things as a reality, things that the general public would consider science fiction. And even within the transhumanist community, they're asking, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be transhuman? And some of them use the language of post-humanity. And these things they're not too far off, I don't think. And I think one day they may creep up on us faster than we can react to it, unless we're staying ahead of it. And I think that's something as Christians or as a church that we need to stay ahead of this thing, because there are deep philosophical questions at play here.
Scott.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, we will have a separate session on
Yep.
transhumanism. But can you please flash back the previous slides by Dr. Heiser? Then that the one. Okay. The other one. Forward. The okay. I think that is very crucial. That is very important. I read the book already. When I got into this part, I was just blown away, and I was looking forward for a time for us to discuss this, and the day has come. I really thank you. I appreciate you for bringing this up. Um, the image. Um, this is really uh, what do you call this? Revolutionary, radical,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not only for us to be able to really answer the challenge of the pro-choice people,
Uh-huh.
like the issue about personhood. When does a person become a person? From the
Yep.
conception. Why? Because he already possessed the image of God. What is that image of God? Well, the image of God, you said, is what? What to reflect, to represent God.
Yep.
And when did that? So when did we start representing God? From the very day, from the very first day, from the
Uh-huh.
day of conception.
Yep.
So I think it is important for our people to really embrace this and spread this. Any person, every person in the reservation in Poplar is an image bearer. God meant for each one to represent, to image God. Well, for them to be able to do that, they have to know who God is. And that is actually the impetus for evangelism. Why do we share the gospel? Because we're trying to introduce God, not only for these people to go to heaven, but for them to be able to accomplish why they're here on earth in the first place, which is to image God. I mean, from here on, we could go each way, in any direction, and it can actually change or alter our perspective. So I am just blown away, really, by this thought, and I thank you for bringing this up, and I hope we could bring this to a wider audience. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
And I think it's something that I feel like we're too distracted right now as believers. I think other things are taking precedence over, you know, these types of questions. There's so much talk about, from my vantage point anyways, I feel like there's a lot of talk about race and other things. And I feel like I got to choose my words carefully, but I think that it can be a distraction.
Be careful because I'm going to post it.
I know. I'm ready though.
Just teasing you. Right, right.
I know a
We'll
lot
back
of
up.
a
We'll
lot
back
of what I'd have
up.
to say, or a lot of what I say, I know isn't popular, and I feel like this stuff, I think because it touches on things that might go against, um I feel like this type of stuff isn't going to be talked about too much in church or in churches.
It's not conventional.
Yeah, it's not. And I think it's going to creep up on a lot of people
Mm.
within the church. Um and they're not going to have an answer for it, And that's why I think it's really important. I think it's extremely important because, like I said, a lot of these uh, medical journals, you know, scientific, technological journals, they're talking about some really strange things that we wouldn't believe unless it came from a scientific source,
Mm.
you know. But it's not talked about very much, you know. We'll get into things like, you know, gene editing and things like that.
Oh, wow, really? Gene
Yeah,
manipulation? Genetic
yeah,
manipulation?
genetic manipulation, things like that. And you know, um but it's, and like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of people think that this is coming purely from a scientific perspective or a secular perspective that is anti religion or anti God, and that's not the case. I believe that, you know, that's a false assumption. I believe that this is really being driven by spirituality. It's being driven by um, mysticism, things like that, enchantment, and they're all tied together. And from some of the things I've been studying, there's these different groups, you know, these different groups of these different worldviews. I'll say there's all these different worldviews, and from what I've studied and from the way I see it, they're all moving in the same direction towards the same thing. It might not, there are distinctives between each group, but it seems like they're all moving towards the same thing. And there's going to come a day where us, the Christians, are going to be the ones saying, well, hold up, like, this isn't a good thing. And we got to have an answer for these things. And I believe we do. I
Mm.
wholeheartedly believe we do. And so that's what we'll look at in the next week, or the
Okay.
next time I do a study, this idea of transhumanism.
Okay. So we can close for tonight,
Yep.
Scott. And but if you could recap this next week for others, you know, the others are not here tonight. Before we start, I will record what's happening next. You know, I would like to have a bit of a discussion while others are here. So if you could just
Uh-huh.
recap, just give us a recap on what's happening next. Um,